Now remember, in step 1B, we talked about how important it is for a tent or a shade structure to be completely dry before being put away. And we really mean completely dry. Think about the expression bone dry. If there was any wetness or any dampness, even the slightest bit, you're going to need to dry it in this step. Due to the waterproof nature of this fabric, the best way to dry a tent or a shade structure is to let it dry itself when it is fully spread out. In other words, when it's pitched like this, because that's when the fabric is tightly stretched across the frame. Unfortunately, you can't really towel it off as a shortcut, because towels often just spread water around. And also, trust me, if there's any creases or folds where water is hiding, it can stay there for quite some time. So that is why on this step, when you're leaving it pitched to dry, there's a few really important things to note. First, if the footprint was also wet, at this point, after you've pitched it, you'll want to remove the footprint and set it aside separately. Do not keep it under the body where it won't receive any ventilation and won't dry. In fact, if the footprint is super wet, you'll notice if you lay it on the floor with one side up, once that side dries, you might have to lay it somewhere else with the other side up for the other side to dry. And of course, if the floor is really wet, then you'll need to wait for the floor to dry so that it doesn't contaminate the fabric with more water. You'll also notice that the rainfly is the part that is least stretched out, because in nature, it really needs to be staked down, and obviously we can't drive stakes into our nice floors. But we can use different heavy objects to weigh the tent and stretch out the fabric. Think about using other gear that we have in the store. If you want, you can even attach clips or strings and attach them to other things in other racks. The other thing is, depending on how wet the tent is and what exactly is wet, you might want to leave the tent pitched with the rainfly over to let the rainfly dry. And then you might have to remove the rainfly to let the body underneath dry separately. The last thing is the floor of the tent. So we removed the footprint already, sure, but remember the tent body has a floor piece of fabric as well. If that is exceedingly wet, you may also want to flip the tent over on its side so that the floor receives the ventilation it needs to dry. At each of these steps, the important thing is to maximize ventilation and minimize contamination. So if the floor is wet or if something else is wet, try to keep the wet pieces and the dry pieces from touching. If you're leaving this tent out to dry, you'll eventually be trained on making a maintenance order in our online system. That way, the next person working on the next shift will understand why there is a pitch tent in the middle of the room. So what usually will happen is that the next person on the next shift will check to see if it's dry. The only thing is, instead of in step 1B, where you check each fabric piece individually, ideally, you would check for dryness while the tent is still pitched. And the reason for that is just because the subsequent steps require you to have the tent still be pitched. So what I'm doing right now is I am running my hands along the edges of the rainfly and then also checking the grommet tabs on the rainfly to make sure that they are dry. When it comes to checking the cross fabric, I can also do that when it's pitched. It's a little bit more easy actually for the rainfly because now I can see more form to this oblong shape and I have a better handle of what really is a large swath that is diagonal kitty corner. The underside is where it gets tricky. But still, you can see how I've unclipped part of the rainfly, allowing me to go under and check the rainfly on the other side to make sure that that side is also dry. A shortcut that I like to call out. As I was checking the grommet tabs for the rainfly, I also pinched the grommet tabs for the body since they're right next to each other. So that means that right now when I'm checking the body, I'm just focused on the edges. In this case, the edges are where the wall meets the floor, and I'm just giving it a squeeze all the way around. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to check across the top, which is the mesh part, lifting up the rainfly to make sure it is dry. And then the other side I'm going to do is the floor. And again, this is just like in step 1B, except that the tent is now fully pitched. So once the tent is flipped over on its side, then I have access to go ahead and check the floor in a cross-line manner to see if it is dry. Once you do these things, the quick reminder I'll give you is don't forget about the footprint. You may have set the footprint aside to dry, but it also needs to be checked to confirm that it is dry before proceeding on to the remaining steps.